I'll be speaking to Nidal Bitari. He's a Palestinian who was born in Yarmouk camp in Syria. He is managing director of People Demand Change, which is based in Washington, D.C. Now, I am doing this interview because I saw one of his tweets. He had a angry tweet a couple days ago in reaction to another tweet by Joshua Landis, who was praising an article on Syria by William Van Wagenen that actually quoted Bitari a lot. So Van Wagenen wrote about the destruction of Yarmouk camp, and the subtitle of the article was How the CIA Helped Jihadist Rebels Invade and Occupy the Capital of the Palestinian Diaspora. So, good evening, Nidal.
Good evening, Stanley. Thank you so much.
In your tweet, you wrote, "This is a complete wrong argument and a misusing of quotes from my articles and others. I will go through it one by one to show the horrible efforts of the author to exonerate Assad and Russians. This is not how history gets written." Let me first go into your background. I've already mentioned you were born in Yarmouk camp. Where were you educated?
Yeah, actually, I was born and raised and studied in Damascus. I studied sociology in Damascus University, and I did my master's in political sociology in Damascus University, and I was enrolled in the PhD program when the revolution started, and then I had to leave Syria before I even start my PhD.
Mm-hmm. And you worked for the Syrian Arab Red Crescent for a while?
Oh yeah, I worked for almost 3 years. The last year in 2000, I think 2010, 2011, I was managing the program of supporting Iraqi refugees in Syria.
And you left in Syria in what year, what month?
I left the Christmas or the New Year's Eve of 2012.
2012. So you were there for
a year, yeah.
A year after the revolution started, or even more.
Yeah.
And you wrote a major piece for the Institute of Palestine Studies called Yarmouk Refugee Camp and the Syrian Uprising, A View from Within. And,
right.
And when was that article written?
Actually, I think it was published. I started writing it in the summer of 2013.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was published sometime in 2014. So it has been now almost 5 years since it was published. Yeah.
All right. So now let's get into the Landis and Van Wagenen and so on. First of all, who is Joshua Landis?
Well, Joshua Landis, as far as I know, he is an American who is interested in the Middle East in general, but as far as I know, he has good connection to Syria, and he is. We can say that he leans to believe the Syrian regime's narrative, and some people look at him as an advocate for the Syrian government in the United States of America.
Now, Landis is praising an article by William Van Wagenen, and what do you know about him?
Well, actually, I don't know him. I've never met him, and we have never been in touch before. It was the first time that I see his name when Joshua endorsed his article. And actually, I'm not that active on social media as well. So some friends approached me and told me that there is this article about Yarmouk camp. And we we think that there is a lot of conflicted information and propaganda inside it. So I looked at it and I read it. It's really like it's a long one. It's not short, and so I went through it, and I wrote that tweet.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the things he says. As you say, it's very long. Can't get into everything. But he writes, flush with weapons supplied by the CIA and Gulf intelligence agencies, rebels from the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian wing Al-Qaeda jointly invaded and occupied Yarmouk in December 2012. Now, number one, it makes the way he wrote it makes it seem like the CIA gave weapons to Al Qaeda. Is there truth in that?
Well, it's not true at all. Um, First of all, actually, the whole argument that he is trying to build in this article is that the CIA armed or supplied Al-Qaeda and extremists inside Syria. And apparently, he really does not know how the size of this program, which was like a very small program, ended up with a big failure. And even the administration during Obama, they admitted that it was called the equipping and the training program. They said that it was like a big failure, and we could not have the capacity and the ability to vet a big number of fighters to train them and to supply them. So they ended up, I think, as far as I remember, the final number of people or fighters who were trained by the CIA were like 100 or 150, and then they shut down this program completely. However, this is part of the story. The other part of the story is that this program was focused on some armed groups and factions that do not have anything to do with what happened in Yarmouk camp at all. And secondly, when the conflict of invading Yarmouk camp started, there was not yet Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS or all these Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. Not only in Yarmouk, actually in Syria in general. So there is a problem with the timeline of his article, and there is also like he is using some controversial information to build an argument.
All right, now
I think this is the weakness of his article.
All right, in that same section I read, he is claiming that the Free Syrian Army and Nusra, which is Al Qaeda, the way he puts it, invaded Yarmouk and cooperated. They made an alliance, essentially, to invade Yarmouk. And for proof, he links to your article, the one that I mentioned earlier. So what do you say about his claim about this cooperative invasion?
No, look, I think this is not a deniable thing. I think this is a truth, and I don't want to deny it. This happened, but it happened later, later on after the invasion of Yarmouk. I think it happened mainly in 2013, in the mid of 2013, when Jabhat al-Nusra became very public inside Al Yarmouk camp. After it was spread all over the southern Syria. So to be honest, Stanley, my problem with this article is not this issue, because everybody now knows knows that there was like kind of coordination between some, not all. He generalizes a lot. Some armed groups, yes, they coordinated with Jabhat al-Nusra, and some armed groups they coordinated with ISIS, not only in Yarmouk camp but also all over Syria. This is something that happened later.
Mm-hmm.
My problem with the article is like two things. The first one is he is trying to exonerate the Syrian government and the Russians from what happened not only inside Al Yarmouk camp, but even in all Syria.
Mm-hmm.
What I saw in this article that he is building this argument and took Al Yarmouk camp as a case study. Why Yarmouk camp? Because honestly, there is a lot of access to information to what happened inside Al Yarmouk camp. A lot of articles, a lot of social media posts, so many information about what happened in Al Yarmouk camp, unlike other areas in Syria. And the narrative that he is trying to build is not only exonerating the Syrian government and the regime and Russians, but also blaming Syrian people for rebelling on a dictatorship. On
Mm-hmm.
in other words, what he is trying to do is to rewrite the narrative of what happened in Syria without mentioning the brutality of the Syrian government and the brutality of Russians and what they have done in Syria. And this is why he is turning a very confirmed facts or confirmed facts that were confirmed by the international community about chemical attacks, and he turned it into like debatable facts, or debatable information. He is kind of saying that the Syrian government did not attack Al Ghouta in August 2013 or 14. I really don't remember. Rather, he's saying that rebels maybe did it or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that. And he goes through many incidents in Syria that were confirmed that the Syrian government did these attacks, and he turned it into doubts.
Let me go
And
back to really at the beginning because he justifies the siege of Yarmouk, and he says the Syrian government then imposed the siege on Yarmouk in an effort to prevent Al Qaeda, hereafter Nusra, and its FSA allies from advancing further on the heart of Damascus. So here he justifies the siege.
Uh, this is kind of where I find that he has lack of background and information of the development or of the situation on the ground in Yarmouk camp in particularly because these groups did not go from Yarmouk camp and attack Damascus. It happened in 2 or 3 incidents, attempts to invade Damascus, but not from Yarmouk camp, from other areas in the suburbs of Damascus. Secondly, he completely ignores and neglects the fact that the Syrian government was supplying even ISIS inside Al Yarmouk camp, and where there are so many articles and so many confirmed information about this issue.
And but
And he
that's years
completely,
later, right?
I mean, like a year later, but
Oh.
it was during the siege. I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying that during the siege, civilians were not allowed to get in and out. But the extremist groups like ISIS, they were allowed to get in and out
Hmm.
and to go and shop in Damascus and go back to a Yarmouk camp. And this happened over like 3 or 4 years, not for a month or two, while people were starving to death inside the camp. The Syrian government was supplying ISIS. And the second issue is, even if there was like extremists like before ISIS, like Jabhat al-Nusra or whoever he's calling like extremists or jihadists inside al Yarmouk camp, this is not a justification for preventing the milk of the kids and the humanitarian deteriorated health cases to get outside of the camp to the hospitals to be treated.
Hmm.
More than 200 were like starved to death inside Yarmouk camp, and the government did not allow any humanitarian aid to enter Yarmouk, not only from the main, the northern gate of Yarmouk, even from the southern gate, where the government was supplying or like allowing some humanitarian assistance to enter to other areas except Yarmouk camp.
Hmm. Now he goes back after doing this, sort of initial idea that it was, you know, Assad defending himself. That's why he did the siege. Then he goes back and says, "All right, let's look into the history." And he goes back to the late spring of 2011 and
Hmm.
demonstrations of Palestinians that went right up to the Israeli border. Israeli soldiers killed maybe 30 people during these two demonstrations, injured hundreds. And then,
Right.
and then Van Wagenen says the Israeli government claimed this was a plan by Assad forces to divert attention from protests against the Syrian government. And he gives a long account of things, and he quotes you on several points.
Hmm.
So, what do you think of his description of those two demonstrations in the spring of 2011?
Yeah, these quotes they were taken out of the context of the article actually, because like in the article, if you read it from the beginning to the end, you would understand that 100% that people, Palestinians inside Syria, most of them they were pro-revolution because they suffered the same suffering that Syrians suffered under this under our Assad regimes, the son and the father. And I addressed many incidents about in the history of Palestinians inside Syria and why Palestinians would support the Syrian revolution. Although I mentioned that the Palestinian society also was divided the same way that the Syrian society was divided toward the revolution. But he is taking these quotes out of the context and to show that that Palestinians wanted to go to these borders, but he does not mention at all that Palestinians were not allowed to approach the border since 1948 until 2010. Palestinians were not allowed to go to the borders like on the anniversaries of An-Nakba or the anniversary of An-Naksa. We were not allowed to go. We would need a permission from the Syrian security services if we want to go to visit the borders,
Mm-hmm.
to go to Al-Qunaitira, for example. While Syrians did not need this permission, and he completely disregards this the fact that the way from the camps in Damascus to the borders were open to Palestinians to go,
Mm-hmm.
and he completely turns fact that Hezbollah and some Palestinian factions, in coordination with the Syrian security, facilitated transporting people from the camps to the borders. He turned it into rumors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
While people who lived in the camp, they know who was coordinating by name, and they know that people who received money from Hezbollah and from other Palestinian factions to facilitate transporting people to the borders.
So, in other words, this wasn't just an Israeli conspiracy story. This is something that Palestinians in Yarmouk were very angry about.
But can you repeat it again?
So, in other words, his charge that that the Israelis were behind stories claiming that Assad and Hezbollah facilitated Palestinians to go to the border and get killed. He's claiming this was all an Israeli lie. And
No, yeah, no. Like, this is what I was saying, that he is trying, like, to turn facts into rumors to build his argument. And listen,
and
like,
you personally were there.
Stanley, I still remember that day, the 2 days, like in May and in June, of these two demonstrations as if they were yesterday. The second time in June, people were chanting and shouting in Ajolan while the Israelis were shooting and killing. People were demonstrating inside, like on the borders, against Al-Assad government. I remember, like, when this people gathered together and they started shouting in Arabic, أسد في لبنان فأر في الجولان. It means he is only a lion in Lebanon, but he is a mouse in Ajolan.
Mm-hmm.
And they were shouting واحد اثنين الجيش السوري وين? 1, 2, where is the Syrian army? Because people were like, and he completely also, like, dismisses this fact that the Syrian Arab Red Crescent withdrew its health workers from the field and left people bleeding behind.
And when you say he, you mean Van Wagenen.
Wagner, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
in his article. So there are so many things in this article that it really, like, for me, it touches me personally, because honestly, and even like the editor of the article I wrote for IPS, the Institute for Palestinian Studies, when she approached me to write this article, I told her, look, I will write this in the honor of my friends who were killed in Syria, jailed to death and tortured to death in Syria. So for me, it's really personal, like, to see, like, he is turning facts into, like, rumors and trying to rebuild a narrative that completely applies to the Syrian government and its allies' narratives.
Now he illustrates the article with that iconic picture from the United Nations in 2014 of an immense crowd of people lining up for food. But he earlier says that the people had all run away, and the camp was just full of Al Qaeda Islamists and some FSA fighters. It seems like a contradiction. Who was this immense crowd of people begging for food?
I mean, like, until ISIS invaded the camp in 2000, the first time in April 2014, there were like about 80,000 civilians inside Yarmouk.
Mm-hmm.
80,000 civilians.
Right.
And none of them was armed. And there were like a few small Palestinian armed groups that were associated with other Syrian armed groups when there was like the Free Syrian Army at the beginning, like of the revolution in Syria. This is something like to turn all people, like the civilians who suffered the siege and suffered the brutality of two actors on the ground, the Syrian government and the extremists, is really humiliating. It's really humiliating. It's not the history of a Yarmouk camp. It's not the history of Palestinians in Syria.
So enough with his article. So what happened then to Yarmouk camp? It was totally destroyed. Is that what happened?
Well, actually, Yarmouk camp does not exist anymore, honestly, Stanley. It was like burned to the ground. It's just like rubble now. There is nothing at all left. I would say like 99% of Al Yarmouk camp is completely gone now. Uh, and people cannot, there is nowhere for like the IDPs, the Palestinian IDPs or like the Syrian IDPs who used to call it home to go back to. It's completely gone.
Very sad.
My two, like I lived in two buildings like in the last like 30 years. Both of them are like just burned to the ground.
Mm-hmm. And where are the Palestinians now? Where did they go to? Scattered everywhere?
Not only everywhere inside Syria, everywhere around the world.
Mm-hmm.
There is more than 100,000 Syrian Palestinians who could reach Europe between Germany and Sweden. I think like most of them between Germany and Sweden. And there is about like 10,000 in Turkey and few hundreds in Jordan. And the rest are like between like Lebanon and Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries around the world. Like half of half of the Syrian Palestinians left Syria already, and half of them are still like they are either still living in what left from the camps. Out of like 13 camps, there are like I think 8 or 9 now.
Mm-hmm.
4 or 5 were completely destroyed. Or in the suburbs of Damascus, under the regime-controlled areas, like renting houses or homeless in the streets or in shelters.
Very sad, very sad. What is your Twitter account for those who are interested in following you and learning more about this?
At Nidal Bitari.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then we will link to that article you wrote a couple of years ago. And thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Stanley, like for following up and like for your continuous support for the cause. Thank you so much.